The Aegis glided through the ink-black expanse of space, its titanium frame humming with the low, familiar pulse of life support systems. Commander Elias Trent stood at the ship's forward observation deck, eyes narrowed against the void. Here, in the uncharted fringes of the outer quadrant, the stars were sparse, distant pinpricks swallowed by shadows older than time. The silence was palpable, as if the universe itself held its breath. The call came at first as a tremor, a subtle shiver that traveled through the ship's hull, making the instruments waver with static. It was faint, a series of pulsing signals that didn't match any known star or transmission. A shiver coursed down Trent's spine as he glanced at Dr. Mira Yates, who was hunched over her console, fingers moving with feverish precision. "Commander, you might want to hear this." Yates's voice was tight, each syllable carrying a hidden weight. The rest of the crew, 6 explorers forged by the unforgiving trials of deep space missions, shifted uneasily as the recording played. The sound was a low, rhythmic thrum, too consistent to be natural and layered with an undercurrent so deep it seemed to tug at their very atoms. "It's a signal," whispered Yates. Her eyes flicked up, their usual sharpness dulled by something Trent couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Number. It was reverence, as if she had just touched the hem of some terrible truth. The Aegis continued its slow drift, pulled by a silent curiosity none of them dared to name. With coordinates locked, the ship cut through the last wisps of stardust until it reached the edge of nothingness, a place so devoid of light that even the onboard sensors balked at its emptiness. And then they saw it, an anomaly against the abyss, a structure so massive and unnatural it seemed born from the fevered dreams of a mad god. The vessel was made of dark, rough stone and metal that glistened with a sickly sheen, marked by symbols that defied earthly language. As the ship's floodlights danced across its surface, the carvings twisted and shifted, as though alive. "Magnify," Trent ordered. The screens zoomed in, revealing intricate details, jagged alien scripts, and depictions of creatures, hulking and grotesque, that stirred some primordial terror within them. They were beings with eyes that spanned their bodies, limbs that bent at impossible angles, and tendrils that coiled into infinity. Silence thickened in the cabin. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, they resonated through the ship, brushing against the walls, curling into the crew's ears like a dark lullaby. Yates clamped her hands to her ears, eyes wide with a dawning horror. "It's speaking. It's in my head." Trent turned, the command to retreat dying in his throat. His hand hovered over the controls, but a soft pulse beneath the deck stopped him. It felt almost like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, thrumming from deep within the structure outside. Navigator Lars Price stared at the readings, his face pale. "Commander, the energy signature, it's increasing." His voice cracked as if it had been stretched thin by the weight of the air. On screen, the dark structure seemed to pulse, in sync with the vibration, a monstrous, steady rhythm that resonated with the ship's own systems. Then the light shifted, a subtle flicker that made Trent squint. The carvings on the structure twisted anew, and for the briefest of moments, a shape slithered between the engraved walls. It was just a shadow, a suggestion of movement, but it sent a ripple of dread through them all. "Prepare for withdrawal," Trent barked. Panic crept into the edges of his tone, gnawing at the stoic mask he wore. But as the crew scrambled, the lights of the Aegis dimmed, sputtering before plunging the cabin into darkness. The ship hummed with a malevolent energy, the whispering now a chorus that spoke in a language none of them understood, yet each felt in their bones. "Emergency systems engaged," shouted Reese, the engineer. Yet nothing responded. It was as though the ship had been swallowed by the presence outside, the control panels now dead metal mocking their desperate stares. Yates's voice rose above the cacophony, thin and strained. "It's not just a structure. It's alive." The pulse intensified, vibrating through their bodies, rattling their teeth, thrumming in their skulls until it felt as if their thoughts were no longer their own. Images flashed in their minds, black oceans frothing with brine, stars collapsing in on themselves, and an expanse of unending darkness where a titanic being stirred, limbs and eyes and an insatiable void for a heart. Trent clenched the edge of his console, knuckles white. "Whatever this is, we need to..." Before he could finish, the whispering turned into a roar, swallowing their shouts. The walls of the Aegis quivered under the force, bending, warping. And outside, the structure loomed closer, its edges blurring, merging with the shadows, ready to consume. And then, silence. A stillness so deep it seemed to press against their chests. The monitors flickered, showing nothing but the abyss and the shifting monstrosity that had emerged from within it. Something had been awakened, something that had waited eons for the call. The Aegis was no longer just a vessel. It was a witness, a herald to a truth the universe had long tried to bury. The whispers that once beckoned were now a symphony of voices, all chanting, welcoming, promising that they would not leave this place as they had come. The Aegis drifted in the grip of the dark structure, tethered not by mechanical bonds, but by an unseen force that seemed to twist reality itself. The corridors of the ship, once humming with the quiet efficiency of deep space travel, had become claustrophobic, the walls pressing in as if they were aware of the secrets beyond them. The silence was broken only by the low hum of life support, now a mocking echo against the symphony of whispers that pervaded the air. Reese sat hunched in the corner of the engine room, eyes wide and glassy, muttering in a voice barely his own. His fingers traced invisible patterns on the cold metal floor, movements jerky and compulsive. Yates approached cautiously, her own hands trembling as if the blood in her veins had turned to ice. She reached out, but before she could touch him, Reese's head snapped up, eyes locking with hers. His pupils were dilated, reflecting nothing but darkness. "They're under the waves," he rasped, voice raw and choked with something not quite human. "We woke them." Yates stumbled back, a scream caught in her throat. She wanted to deny it, to reassure herself that Reese's words were nothing more than the ramblings of a mind frayed by stress. But she couldn't. The whispers had been growing louder, weaving into the fabric of their thoughts like a parasite. In the mess hall, Price paced back and forth, his boots clanging against the floor in a staccato beat that mirrored the tension in his chest. He gripped a data slate, the screen cracked from how many times he had slammed it in frustration. Numbers, once the familiar comfort of coordinates and navigation paths, now morphed into meaningless symbols that spiraled and twisted like serpents. "It doesn't make sense," he said, eyes darting between Trent and Dr. Voss, who sat slumped at the table, eyes vacant. "We should be able to chart a path out of here. We should be moving." Commander Trent's face was shadowed, the stark lighting emphasizing the lines etched by years of space travel. But now those lines seemed deeper, carved by the oppressive weight of their situation. He turned to the viewport where the structure loomed outside, its walls now slick with a substance that glistened darkly, almost as if the very stone bled. "We're anchored by something not of this world," Trent said, each word heavy, final. "I don't think we're meant to leave." Before anyone could respond, the ship shuddered, a tremor that seemed to come from inside its own metal bones. The lights flickered, casting jagged, erratic shadows. A sound echoed through the corridors, a scraping, wet and slow, as if something massive dragged itself along the outside of the ship. Price's breath caught, his pulse thundering in his ears. He stared at the viewport, watching as a long, slick tendril slithered past, leaving a trail of dark ichor against the glass. Did anyone else see that? Voss's voice was barely a whisper, and no one dared answer. Silence reclaimed the room, punctuated only by the distant thump of their own heartbeats. It was then that they realized the ship had become unnaturally warm, as though a fever spread through its walls. Elsewhere, the crew's paranoia fermented. Quinn, the ship's medic, stood in front of the crew quarters, hands clasped around a scalpel she had taken from the infirmary. The blade glinted under the sporadic, failing lights, a fragile promise of control. She looked at Yates, who watched her from the end of the hallway, with eyes sunken and red-rimmed. "Do you hear them?" Quinn's voice was barely recognizable, as if filtered through layers of static. "They're inside us now, whispering." Yates felt the words coil in her mind, taking root. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the visions continued. Seas of black, endless and churning, with massive figures undulating beneath the surface, their eyes aglow with an alien malice. When she opened her eyes, Quinn was gone, the hallway empty but for the scalpel that now lay clattering on the floor. The mutiny of sanity was complete. Dr. Voss, who had once lectured about astrophysics to halls full of eager students, sat mumbling equations that spiraled into nonsense, a thin trickle of blood running from his nose. The bridge had become a realm of mutters and half-screamed warnings as crew members babbled about visions of impossible landscapes and voices that knew their names, called them in tones so familiar it felt like their own thoughts speaking back. Trent clenched his fists and forced himself to stand. The whispers twisted around him, threading through his resolve like tendrils. They spoke of surrender, of becoming part of the living darkness that waited beyond. But he forced his gaze to the viewport once more, watching as the structure outside shifted again, a portion of its wall peeling away to reveal a mouthless face etched with countless eyes, each one brimming with stars. The ship shook, the sound of metal tearing reverberating through the bridge as a cry erupted from one of the lower decks. It was Reese's voice, raw with terror, and then abruptly cut off. Trent's throat tightened. He couldn't allow the madness to take them all. They were explorers, they were human, and they still had breath left to fight. "Everyone, to the bridge now!" Trent's command shattered the paralysis, gripping the few who were still coherent. Yates, Price, and Quinn staggered in, their faces pale and hollow. The whispers rose in volume, promising salvation and despair in equal measure. But before any plan could be forged, the lights failed entirely. They stood in pitch black, hearing the slow rhythmic thumping of something colossal moving outside, feeling its resonance deep in their bones. Then, a single eye blinked open on the viewport, as vast as the room itself and as dark as the void between galaxies. The ship was not a fortress, it was a womb. and they were inside, being prepared, reshaped by something that had waited millennia to remember what hunger truly felt like. The Aegis was now a living tomb. The corridors hummed with a frequency that pressed against their ears, seeping into the marrow of their bones. What little light remained on the ship was dim and sickly, casting everything in an eerie, greenish pallor. The air grew thick, heavy with the coppery tang of fear and the inexplicable scent of brine. The whispers were no longer confined to the edge of hearing. They had evolved into a cacophony, a chorus of voices that spoke in a tongue unknown to any of them, but that each somehow understood. Their words slithered into thoughts, unraveling the thin threads that held reason together. Commander Trent paced the bridge, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to resist the seductive cadence of the voices. He slammed a fist down on the console, ignoring the pain as he met the hollow stares of what remained of his crew. Yates stood closest, her face gaunt and eyes bloodshot. Quinn and Price were near the viewport, their eyes fixed on the structure outside, its surface writhing with shapes that hinted at life, trapped just beyond perception. "They're calling us," Yates said, her voice cracking like an old recording. "Not just calling, commanding." Trent gritted his teeth, refusing to give in to the feeling clawing at the edges of his mind. But the truth was undeniable. Each second they spent aboard the ship brought them closer to that place where sanity shattered. The whispers had become a tide, washing over them, carrying with it fragments of memory that were not their own, visions of colossal beings drifting in the void, tentacled and crowned in a halo of dying stars. Outside, the structure pulsed with the same rhythm as their heartbeats, synchronizing with each breath they took, until it felt as though they were breathing as one entity. Price let out a strangled laugh, tears streaming down his face. "It knows us. It knows everything," he choked out, fingers pressing against the viewport as if trying to merge with the dark beyond. Suddenly, the whispers changed pitch, their tone shifting from a murmur to a growl that reverberated through the ship. The temperature dropped and frost crept across the bulkheads in spidery veins. The sound of something moving beneath the deck plates filled the silence that followed, a dragging wet noise that made their skin crawl. "We need to fight it," Trent said, his voice desperate but firm. "It's feeding on us, on our fear, our thoughts. If we let it take us, it wins." But even as he spoke, doubt coiled inside him like a serpent. How could they fight something that was not just outside the ship, but inside them, entwined with their very essence? Quinn staggered backward from the viewport, eyes wide with terror. "It's coming in," she gasped. "It's inside." The metal creaked, groaned as though under the weight of an invisible force, and then a black ooze began to seep from the seams in the walls. It pulsed like a living thing, spreading with a purpose. Yates stepped back, trembling as the substance pooled at their feet, coiling around their boots. It was cold, impossibly cold, and as it touched their skin, the whispers became screams. They clutched their heads, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The voices spoke of the deep, of the cities drowned in stars, of gods that had slumbered and now opened eyes that burned with a light older than galaxies. Then, for the first time, one of the whispers separated from the rest, its tone low and rumbling, a voice that was not just heard but felt in their chests. "You are chosen. You are witness." Trent's knees buckled, and he fell to the floor as images surged through him. He saw the expanse of black oceans stretching infinitely under alien skies, their surfaces alive with the glistening movement of things not meant to be seen. He felt the cold embrace of the abyss, deeper than any earthly ocean, a realm where light was devoured and time had no meaning. He snapped back to the present, sweat slicking his skin despite the cold. The others were on the floor too, eyes closed, expressions contorted in silent terror. Yates's mouth moved as if forming words, but only a soft, hoarse sound emerged. Suddenly, the ship shuddered violently, and a new sound joined the din, a deep, mournful bellow that seemed to emanate from the structure itself. It resonated through their chests, deeper and more potent than any machine could create. The lights flickered and the oozing substance withdrew, slithering back into the walls as if called home. The whispers fell silent and the bridge filled with a suffocating stillness. No one dared move. Trent pushed himself to his feet, legs trembling. Outside, the structure shifted, the grotesque carvings shifting in a way that suggested movement, breath. It opened, not like a door, but as if the stone and metal peeled apart to reveal a tunnel lined with rows of glistening spines that moved rhythmically, alive. A new fear set in. The silence wasn't an end, it was an invitation. Price, his mind shattered past reason, rose with an empty expression. He walked to the viewport, pressing his face against the glass. "We are nothing compared to what waits in the dark," he said, and then, as the ship's trembling resumed, he turned to face them. "But now we know." A sudden jolt sent him sprawling, but his eyes never left the sight outside. The tunnel, now fully revealed, seemed to beckon, drawing the ship closer without engines, without thrusters, pulled by an ancient will that needed no technology. Trent knew in that moment, as he felt the whispers return in a collective sigh, that they were being brought into the core of an entity so immense, so beyond comprehension, that understanding it would unravel what remained of them. But this was no longer about survival. It was about bearing witness to something that defied existence itself. The Aegis shuddered as it was drawn into the mouth of the dark. The last thing Trent saw before the lights failed was a field of eyes blinking open in the walls, each one reflecting a truth too vast, too terrible to comprehend. And then the darkness closed around them, and there were only voices. The descent was slow and relentless. The Aegis pulled ever deeper into the yawning maw of the alien structure. The faint tremors that had rattled through the ship were replaced by a profound stillness, a suffocating silence that felt sentient, as if the ship itself had been swallowed by an abyss that rejected even the idea of sound. Trent's eyes flicked around the darkened bridge, the only illumination now coming from the glow of the strange spines lining the tunnel they had entered. The rhythmic pulse of the alien light matched the beat of his heart, faster now, pounding with a desperation that bordered on hysteria. Sweat trickled down his temples, cold and sticky, as he took in the sight of his crew. Yates sat slumped, her back against the wall, eyes wide but unseeing, lips moving without sound. The others were scattered, some on their knees, others curled into themselves as if folding into the smallest versions of who they once were. Price, who had held on longer than most, now whispered incoherent prayers, each word drenched in defeat. The Aegis was no longer moving under its own power. The sensation of the deck beneath Trent's feet had changed. It was as though they were drifting on a current, carried by an unseen tide deeper into the heart of an ancient, unspeakable machine. Then came the noise, so faint that it could have been imagined, but it pierced the silence like a needle. It was a hum, low and insistent, layered with a thrum that resonated deep within their chests. Trent realized with a lurch that it was not mechanical but organic, a heartbeat that was not their own. The tunnel walls contracted and expanded with it, as if they were trapped inside the throat of a beast so colossal it defied comprehension. Quinn's head jerked up suddenly, eyes red-rimmed and glassy. "It's awake," she said, the words more breath than sound. No one needed to ask what it was. They had felt it long before seeing it, an ancient, sleeping god that had reached out to them through space, threading itself into their consciousness with whispers and visions of black seas and cold stars. Suddenly, the bridge flooded with light, blinding and unnatural. The spines along the tunnel walls had ignited, glowing with an intense blue radiance that flickered and pulsed in sequences too deliberate to be mere happenstance. They were surrounded now by an array of eyes that opened one by one, lids peeling back to reveal irises flecked with starlight. These were not just eyes, they were gateways, conduits to places beyond their universe, where sanity dissolved and time unraveled. "Look away," Trent shouted, but his voice felt small, swallowed by the immensity pressing in on them. It was already too late. Quinn's eyes locked with one of the luminous portals, her mouth opening in a silent scream as the light poured into her pupils, drowning her in a radiance that consumed. She froze, a grotesque statue with eyes that glowed blue, her skin taking on a sheen that was both beautiful and horrifying. "Quinn!" Yates lunged forward but fell back, gasping as something unseen repelled her, something that pulsed in the light. Quinn remained motionless, an empty shell caught in the thrall of the creature that surrounded them. The hum intensified and the whispers returned, louder now, deeper. They no longer spoke in riddles. They spoke in commands. "Join us. See as we see. Be as we are." The bridge vibrated with the words, and Trent's vision blurred, the walls of the ship warping into strange, undulating shapes. But Trent refused to yield. He gritted his teeth, fighting the pressure that squeezed his mind like a vice. He forced himself to focus on the viewport, where the tunnel ahead widened into a cavernous chamber, a space so immense it seemed to house galaxies within its walls. In the center, suspended by tendrils of living darkness, was the source of the hum, a mass of limbs and eyes, mouths that moved in silent synchrony. It was ancient, eternal, and beyond comprehension. It was Cthulhu. A shudder passed through the ship as the Aegis was drawn into the chamber, drifting like an offering. The crew's struggles became weaker, as if the will to resist had been siphoned away. Yates reached for Trent, her fingers brushing his, the contact grounding them both for one last moment of clarity. "We can't. Let it take us," she said, voice cracking but fierce. Her eyes met his, and for a moment they were back on Earth, standing on the deck of the launch station, watching as the blue sky stretched above them, unaware of the void that waited beyond. Trent swallowed hard and nodded, feeling the weight of command settle over him one last time. With what strength remained, he reached for the console, fingers trembling but determined. He activated the emergency override, the ship's last line of defense. The self-destruct sequence began, a quiet beep cutting through the whispers, punctuating the moment like a heartbeat. The eyes in the chamber blinked in unison, as if aware of the choice that had been made. The mass at the center shifted, tendrils writhing in agitation. The whispers turned to roars, but there was no time left. "Hold on," Trent whispered, squeezing Yates' hand as the countdown ticked down its final seconds. Light flared from the console, blinding, scorching, obliterating the darkness with an explosion of searing white. There was no sound, no sensation, only light so intense that it erased everything: fear, memory, existence. And then, in the vastness of the void, there was silence. But it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something that watched, waiting in the spaces between stars, in the depths of forgotten black seas. A silence that promised the echoes would come again, that the song of the deep had only begun. And the universe, in its infinite darkness, held its breath,